time to continue. So we have time until 16:15 at maximum to discuss in a roundtable the direction that European social policy should be having from the perspective of EU countries. And we have two invited commenters there who can start within a minute when I have made a little quote. And that quote is what what partly is mentioned in today's program, and that quote comes from the Euro area recommendations for 2017. So in the semester, European semester process, the difference between country-specific recommendations, so policy recommendations to be implemented by individual member states, and Euro area recommendations, which are all the member states in the Euro area, is first of all that the Euro area recommendations will come already in November, and that will give us much more time to discuss in the European institutions, in the member states, the direction that then individual member states also should take later on the year. And the country-specific recommendations then are published in May every year. Now, what the quote says, or in the Euro area recommendations, there are 5 recommendations, and I just mentioned one of them, and not fully, but taking selected parts so that you see the relevance or the role that social aspects have within the economic governance and specifically Euro area recommendations. So the third recommendation reads as follows, and it starts by saying that hereby the Council recommends to the Euro area member states to implement reforms that promote job creation, social fairness and convergence, underpinned by an effective social dialogue. And then it goes on and continues saying they should combine 1. Reliable labour contracts, and I'm shortening now slightly. 2. Quality and efficient education and training systems. 3. Effective active labour market policies. And 4. Modern and adequate social protection systems that support those in need to provide incentives for labour market integration. So it's clearly in part of the recommendations for Euro area member states. Now we come to the second part of the discussion. What direction should then the European social policy take? And the main vehicle maybe that could be used for that is a European semester process, apart from legislation and good practice and that kind of activities. And that is now part of this soft law that was, or not soft law, but soft, how did we beautifully put it earlier, this soft governance somebody was using. And one of our speakers felt soft governance, I'm skeptical, and for reasons that she explained. And one felt there's a lot has been happening in soft governance, but now, and that's, we heard reasoning for that as well. And now the next question is, what should happen in the future? How could and should that be further developed? And is then soft governance, or how that soft governance should be developed, and maybe even hard governance. And I'll invite first Kirsi-Marja Lehtelä, who is a project manager in the Norden 2020 project from the National Institute for Health and Welfare, to take the floor, please.
Thank you, Ismo. It's my pleasure to see you all here today, because this is part of the project I'm leading. The main core in that project is the challenges of the Nordic welfare states. And as Dorte put it in her presentation already, so I'm not going into those challenges here and now. we have, but I will say a few words about the Nordic cooperation, because when we speak among these 5 states and with the 3 autonomous areas, we sort of have same language. And that's the problem, I think, within the European context. When we speak about the social dimension or social policy, we mean the very broad welfare policy, and that includes also education, employment, labor market policies, and even certain cultural features. And last but not least, gender equality. That's the very, very solid ground in all sort of discussions. So that's made clear. So when we go to this soft governance, so the issue, is it sort of something giving results or not? I would say that we have an example, and it's 60 years cooperation between 5 countries. There are researchers and politicians that claim that Nordic countries have a common values. I think this a little bit sort of mystical, historical thinking. We are similar due to this soft governance we've been doing, peer reviewing, discussing, and also making clear how these virtuous circles in society affect each other's, and the universal thinking. And I think it was Bart that mentioned that Finland has a very strong position in order that we are a small country and we can sort of show how social development is behind the economic success. And there is an academic and scholar agreement on that Finland has been gaining most about the Nordic cooperation. Finland was in the 60s long behind the neighboring countries. And after the Public Health Act in 72, the school reform, the educational reform in the mid-70s, and last in the beginning of 80s, the Poor Relief Act was actually abolished, and the new modern social assistance system was enacted in the country. So it took about 20-25 years to take a huge leap towards a modern society with very, very little socioeconomic differences. And it has been also, I can't be commenting as a political scientist, this issue that politics is not based on facts. Well, politics is based always on values, and that's how it should be. But the values the politicians sort of create, they are based on facts. And this is one of the very strong points of the politics, and also in the Nordic cooperation, that we produce these facts. I've been very long time in Nordic cooperation, and I can see that when the times are bad and when there is austerity, then the interest, the political interest, grows. It increases in Nordic countries, and now we are sort of at the top of it. So it's a kind of an interesting thing to see when I was listening to Bart, to hear that even European discussions are moving towards this type of understanding that social issues do matter. And the politics are sort of, this huge apparatus, European cooperation, is slowly moving in the direction of having as a goal more sustainability in countries and within EU. And one word what you can use when you're describing Nordic countries is they are very sustainable societies in all aspects. And that's one really concrete goal to set also on the European agenda, I guess. So I had some comments and an introduction also to this discussion. And I have my colleague here. We work in the same research unit.
Thank you very much. Let me just say one thing, because I think you said something very relevant also, as you said also from the European point of view. But it's true that Finland certainly benefited most of this cooperation between the Nordic member states. But in fact, the other Nordic member states benefited of a well-off, strong Finland enormously as well, which is something that we sometimes forget when we talk in the European context, that the Eastern European countries, let's say some Southern European countries, developing stronger societies, social security systems, stronger economies, better competitiveness. In fact, it benefits the Nordic countries as well. And it's often that I think all too often that we forget that aspect when we are just thinking about ourselves in a more limited sense. So very, very useful reminder of that. Now, Pasi, Moisio, your turn. Floor is yours, please.
Oh. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me as a commentator. And I have a very practical suggestion in a sense. In a sense, we, like Kirsi-Marja mentioned, we work in the same research institute, and our main job is to kind of come up with an idea how to implement and build legislation on the politicians and political scientists' ideas and visions of reforming society and social policy in a sense. And what I have, wondering, listening to this presentation and also in the previous years, has been that why not anyone has ever tried to build EU-level minimum income, at least in a paper. I mean, it's a massive work, and actually this graph in the showing there is going back to there, trying to explain to you why it's so difficult, just to make sure that you don't think that it will take few months for a research team to come up with a EU-level minimum income scheme. Perhaps I will be a bit bold or kind of a provincial by saying that Finnish nationalized, right-based, comprehensive social assistance system that came into action beginning of this year can be served as a, not necessarily a role model, but at least some kind of a basic structure or of architecture, what EU-level minimum income scheme might look like. I don't know if you have followed the Finnish social assistance minimum income development, but beginning of this year, and the social assistance was centralized or nationalized into a national pension fund, and before that, the social assistance has been quite not unique, but rather exceptional. Compared to other Nordic countries, for example. It's strictly right-based, like in France, but it's comprehensive, like in other Nordic countries. So, in that shell, the kind of a drawback of that is that social assistance have become more or less almost too powerful or too strong component of the income protection system in Finland, but that's other thing. Not let go there. But saying this, I would say it's very, very difficult job to come up with the EU-level minimum income scheme, even in the paper or in a report. These are kind of a scheme why it's so difficult. The first of all, social assistance or minimum income at the bottom. Of course, it include quality social services and also health services in that sense. But the level of minimum income or social assistance in the different EU countries, of course, depends and has to depend on the minimum benefits level in that country and also the minimum wage level in that country. It cannot be over the minimum wages in a sense that other than, well, it can be, but it will have most likely rather unwanted economic consequences. But you have to take this into consideration. And in many EU countries, you actually have minimum wages below the level of quality life and subsistence. Oh God, sorry, I can't pronounce that. It's too late and it's November. Yeah, November, talking about the lights. This is actually explaining why the consumption of coffee is highest per capita in Finland. You know, it's rather wrong. But anyway, one of the first problems of building a minimum income scheme in Europe is simply that in many European countries the minimum wages are so low that the adequate living standards would require higher social assistance or minimum income than the minimum wages. So you need to actually push up the minimum wages. And the easiest thing to do is push up the average wages, which leave the room to minimum wages to go up. So everything is tandem in that sense. That was my kind of a second point in this graph. It's borrowed from Eve Mark's presentation a few years back. It's simple, but it's kind of a very informative. It's just put it in a nice graph. The fact that if you want to build a minimum income level that is adequate, you need to look or respond somehow on the minimum wages issue, but also in that way also the average wages in that society. But saying this, I would say that you need to at least try to build up EU level minimum income. It's a massive task. Dr. mentioned the discretion in minimum income schemes, and that's really a black box. Even in the European Union level, we don't really have any comparative studies or research level and amount of discretion in social assistance schemes, for example. So that's the first step we need to do. But we should do it. And the EU level minimum income scheme have been on the agenda so long, so I think somebody should at least try to make some kind of a blueprint how it might work in the EU. That's in a nutshell. Thank you. No. That was a crowd saying that if you want me to do it, just give me a lot of money and a lot of years, please.
No, we are not working for money. We are working for quality. Anyway, thank you very much, Pasi. We've heard the two invited comments. Would our keynote speakers have immediate reactions to that? Please. Dorte? Okay, Bart, go over first.
Yes, thank you. No, since Pasi mentioned the issue of minimum income, so there is a concrete proposal has been prepared by the European Anti-Poverty Network, EAPN, asked independent consultants, among whom Anne van Anker, who's a former Social Democratic MEP from Belgium, to draft a directive on the European minimum income. So the text is out there. The only thing it does is, well, the only thing is ask, or it would oblige member states to adopt a nationally defined minimum income. Right? So it's not about the harmonization of the criteria, it's about obliging member states to adopt a minimum income. Because as you know, there are still a few member states that don't have a national minimum income. Now, the thing is that not exactly this proposal, but the idea of having a directive on a European minimum income was discussed at some point at an informal meeting of the Ministers of Social Affairs during the Belgian presidency of the EU in 2010. I unfortunately didn't attend the meeting, but apparently 27 member states said no. Belgium didn't express itself because it had the presidency. This is why I think at the same time this idea has to be kept on the agenda. So I agree someone should, or people should continue working on it. At the same time, politically it's, to be clear, a dead-end street to arrive at this moment at such a directive. This is why I suggested that at least what you could do, or what someone, a presidency could do, is to continue the discussion on what the criteria would be for defining at the national level an adequate level of income, because even that we do not know. And there I think scholars like yourself can really continue working on that. This said, I also, when preparing the Belgian presidency in 2001, so even much longer ago, the year before the presidency we tried to arrive at a harmonized basket of goods and services between Belgium and the Netherlands. It should be so simple. You know, between these countries we arrive at a harmonized basket of goods and services that would then allow us to put an amount on what a minimum income should be in those countries. Because culturally we're so close, etc. We didn't get there. We could not agree on this basket of goods and services between two countries. So this, I think, is again a no-go zone. By contrast, final words, Chairman, what we see is that in some countries the EU poverty norm, so 60% of the median income, the EU poverty norm, which is linked to the Laken indicators on poverty and social exclusion, and thus part of the soft governance. It has become the official threshold to determine the minimum income, to determine minimum pensions, etc., which is then embedded in national legislation. So this is one of the illustrations where soft governance becomes legislation at the national level, which I think is a very good practice. So yes, in sum, we should continue this exercise on minimum income, but if we can arrive at a directive that just obliges member states to have such a minimum income at the national level, and define some criteria for assessing adequacy, it's already a huge step forward.
Thank you very much. I think this is a really interesting idea, but also previous experiences tells us that it may eventually politically be quite uphill to come through with such an idea. So perhaps it's also interesting to discuss some of your other items of your triangle. So for example, the minimum wage. So will we see such come forward as part of the social agenda of the European Commission? And what political obstacle may that also face? So I know for sure that Denmark it will not be an easy go in my own member state. I don't know about the other Nordic member states, but just to say that even those who have been presented on as part of the agenda setting of the social pillar is already confronted with some political concerns. So perhaps it's also time to redirect the discussion, and instead of presenting new ideas and new initiatives, we should also focus on the enforcement of already existing legislation. And those part of the EU social agenda which are not sufficiently enforced. And there a particular concern could be, for example, the Posting of Workers Directive, the initiatives taken against social dumping, which is also part of the whole politicization we see ongoing in the European Union. So perhaps a new part of the Commission's initiatives should face and focus more on the national enforcement of EU rules to ensure compliance with, for example, minimum wage, health and safety at the workplace, and so forth. So positive is that now the new negotiation of the Posting of Workers Directive speaks about remuneration instead of minimum wage, but there's still an ongoing problem that many of these rules are not enforced in the member states. They are not enforced sufficiently, and that creates particularly problems. And it seems also to be that the Commission is not so eager any longer in its infringement proceedings against the member states. So more depends on actually national compliance, national enforcement of the rules. So there is more need for the Commission to take on its role as guardian of the treaty, but also for the member states to actually take their social responsibilities, to take them forward and comply. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorte. And now Pasi has been waiting for almost an hour to come out with ammunition, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, indeed. I feel like sitting in the burning coals. First of all, I thank you, of course, for the keynote speakers' interventions. I want to come back to what you, Ismo, read before the keynote speaker started. You read about Commission recommendation 2017 to the Eurozone area. I want to highlight that this was the Commission's recommendation. And then if you look at the text, it is very much targeted orientated approach in it. And as I mentioned in my earlier intervention, that is not perhaps the traditional Nordic way to see this issue. And then we raised together with the Minister of Finance this issue up in Brussels, and then it was changed. This is not the final, this is only a Commission's proposal. The Council changed the approach, and now it's more suitable to our perspective. It's not targeted orientated anymore. So this is one point. And then the second point is you, Kirsi-Marja, you mentioned that you are happy that European in the EU social issues are more on the agenda, and yes, they are. But the tools and perspectives are different. For example, regarding the investment package, Bart mentioned. That was again a huge debate in the Brussels. The Commission proposed investment package, which was yet again very, very much targeted orientated. But Council changed it. So the approach is different. So when we are talking about the social issues in the EU level, there are kind of different angles, different perspectives. And then, as I mentioned in my intervention earlier, for that particular reasons, it is extremely important that Nordic countries are involved in this discussion actively, because our perspective is a little bit different than Central Europe and then some other countries. For example, regarding the minimum income, I have been listening to that discussion for years now. And it has been at some point it was very difficult to make my colleagues understand that you need to take services into account also. It's not cash benefits which we should be talking about, but you should take also the services into account when defining minimum income aspect. So I just wanted to underline that the perspectives are different, and the Nordic perspective would be a very, very valuable contribution to this EU discussion. And finally, Mr. President, somebody mentioned earlier that it was ever you, that your perspective is more kind of EU should stick with our key and there should not be concentrating of social issues. Something like that. Anyway, but my point is that train is going on as we speak. The semester process is going, and from the macroeconomic perspective, social issues are of course interesting, as the social and health issues are interesting, since they are covering a big part of the national budgets. So the discussion is going on, and then we should kind of decide, are we actively participating to this EU discussion or not? And that's perhaps time for me to end. I have one point still, but I don't remember what it is, so it was important.
We believe it is important, and we let you reflect upon that and come with further questions in a moment. But now it's time for the rest of us. You've heard 5 interventions, and here comes the first one, please.
Thank you, Chair. Jenny Pääkkönen, Ministry of Finance. I'm also the head of EPC, Economic Policy Delegation of Finland. I would like to support Pasi's intervention about this Nordic and European area recommendations. I was a bit surprised that you cite the Euro area recommendations, given that Finland is the only country that is in the Euro, and not even all Nordic countries are in the EU. So this is kind of a discussion of ins and outs. And I always say that if the other Nordic countries would be members of Euro or at least in the European Union, we would have more leverage in discussions, because now Finland is often representing Nordic countries solely, or maybe sometimes with Sweden and Denmark. Now, there's this question, in what direction should European social policy be developed from the perspective of the Nordic countries? I would like to hear more comments on this area. But one of my concerns is that, given that in EU we are very heterogeneous countries, so if we start harmonizing social protection systems or social policies, we might end up with the risk that we converge to the lowest standards and not to the highest standards. And I think this is also a discussion that, Pasi, you are very familiar with in your committee. So this is one of the reasons we often cite that we would also see these handled in national competencies. As there's this risk of really converging to the lowest standards, and also because other Nordic countries are not in Euro, then we are risking that we are losing some interesting insights. But I didn't have much questions, but I would like to hear your comments about what would be the Nordic role in European Union and in social protection systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jenny. I liked particularly your invitation to Euro, to the other Nordic member states. They will certainly join us soon. I let my colleagues here answer to your questions, because you had a question as well. But are there other comments or questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Maija Isles from the Finnish Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, from the Group of International Affairs, Pasi's group. It'd be interesting to hear the speakers' views on because the concept of enforcing existing legislation was already mentioned. So the role of the Charter of Fundamental Rights in this discussion, because that includes provisions on social rights as well, and it is a piece of legally binding legislation in the EU, and it obliges member states as well when they apply EU legislation broadly. So I'd be interested in hearing your views.
That was a good reminder. Any other? Eva? Yes.
If there's nobody else, I'll try to come back on kind of everything we heard from the very beginning. Try to keep it as short as possible, as a few observations. First of all, kind of a more kind of personal observations from working both on the national side and the Commission side is that there's a lot of lost in translation. We all think that we speak brilliant English. That's debatable, but the way we use the terminology is very, very different. Two key examples. Social is used a lot wider in English than it is in Danish. Social partners is not sociale partner. In Danish, that's partners of the labor market. So there is a misunderstanding when we talk about social rights, social pillar, social union. Because in Danish, and I think it's the same in most of the other Nordic languages, that social means core welfare, more than the wider concept of the labor market. And the same a little bit with rights. At least for me, that has a very legally binding connotation. So now we have a pillar of social rights that's mostly labor market policies and have principles but not legal rights. So that's the first obstacle in communicating about social policies in Europe, that we have a very different starting points about what it is we're talking about. So that's just to say that that explains some of the confusion. Turning to the social pillar, I'd say that the Danish government's been very clear on that we support it because it's not legislative and because it's principles, not rights. But that also means we have to be very clear, and I think that was what I said earlier that Pasi commented on. We have to be very clear what we're trying to achieve and what we're not trying to achieve. Because the worst thing is when we tell our citizens that EU can solve a lot of things where EU doesn't have the tools. The responsibilities lies in the member states. And it's a shame when member states can push the blame to Brussels. So it goes both ways. It's both that, I think Bart said that member states have a tendency to take credit when things go well and blame Brussels. Well, Brussels also have to be selective about when they take the responsibility. And they also have to be clear about what is shared responsibility and what is member state responsibility. So it goes both ways. Minimum income, I'm not sure we have enough time. I think it's just very, very quickly to say that it's contested. Minimum income understood as social assistance exists, but it's means tested. Minimum income understood as minimum wages. Well, they're the social partners on the labor market, at least in Denmark, are very clear. Minimum wages are set by collective agreement by the unions and the representatives of the employers. It's a hands-off approach to the state and the EU. So if the EU is serious about social dialogue and listening to social partners, then they also have to take the view of social partners into account. And at least here, it's seen as quite problematic. I'll have to say it's not my area of expertise, so I won't get deeper into the debate. A few times, I'm almost towards the end now, a few times the concept of poverty, risk of poverty, etc., the poverty target has been mentioned. I'll just like to underline the view of my government. I was also present when we negotiated the indicators of the Europe 2020 strategy. It's a headline, it's a combined indicator of 3 sub-indicators. Risk of poverty is one of them, but material deprivation and jobless households are the two others, and they make sense combined. We have to be careful not just to focus on the one that's on relative income, because it is an arbitrary 60%, and it's a very relative indicator. And the problem with it is that the solution is send more money, and that's not always the solution. To explain it shortly, we need to look at other possibilities: education, labour market inclusion, wider social inclusion. So it's just to be careful that we use the full terminology of poverty and social inclusion, because that's what the strategy is on, not just the risk of poverty indicator. And my final point, and I'll try to make it short, is on the semester. We're actually quite positive on the semester. I'm not sure we see the same problems as my Finnish colleagues with the economic versus the social CSRs. We very much see the strength of the semester being the ability to combine the structural reforms with the social, education, labour market, etc. Because without the sound structural reforms, the sound economics, we can't afford the rest, to put it very bluntly. So that's for us a very strength of the semester, and something that you have to keep in the long run. Earlier, just 10 years ago when I started, we often saw that member states lifted national debates between the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Ministry of Finance till the EU committees and tried to battle each other there rather than at national level. And that's something that the semester has addressed very efficiently. For me, the challenge of the semester is we have fewer and fewer CSRs. None of the Nordic have any CSRs on labour market or social affairs any longer. So how do we renew the semester? How do we integrate the social pillar and keep the semester relevant? Because it's a good tool, even if it's soft law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. Very comprehensive. We take one more comment or question, if there is. Yes, please.
My name is Eivind Opland. I'm from the Norwegian Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. We, of course, have a different role. We're not part of the union as such, but in terms of the Nordic cooperation on EU questions, I think I heard lots of interesting things for the Nordic 2020 project, and which we very much support. And we produce facts in the Nordic region, and we are, as a region, quite similar, and we have a lot of knowledge and experience in a lot of the fields and areas that are discussed in the EU. And this we can build on also towards the EU, I believe. So in terms of this, we should use the knowledge that we have and the knowledge that we can share and the statistics and the data. And of course, we are not in the semester process. We're not in the social pillar as such, but of course the results and the approaches that are taken on an EU level as a part of the internal market is also relevant for us. So we very much support the knowledge sharing and the knowledge build-up in the Nordic region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I personally would most welcome Norway to the semester process and to share that experience. It's a valuable way of discussing and comparing our views about things. Now, let's start. We have 5 panelists today that we have heard, and we go now the other way around, and we start with Pasi, if you want to comment what has been heard until now. And then we go to Dora and Bart, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly, Eva raised a lot of important issues. For example, this concept of social, for example, protection. It has a completely different meaning in our national language than in English. And in EU, from EU perspective, it's extremely broad. It's covering education, labour, social health, occupational health and safety. It's an extremely broad concept, and that is extremely good that you raised this issue up. One concrete issue, what I actually wanted to raise up myself also, is the role of the CSRs. And Bart mentioned earlier that there is a little bit kind of twisted balance in that sense that Central and Eastern European member states, they got more CSRs regarding the social issues than for example, we. And Eva mentioned that Nordic countries don't have much CSRs nowadays. We, of course, we regularly have. We have regarding the pensions and now the social and healthcare reform. There is always a CSR coming to Finland. But my point is that should we actually concentrate on the real and concrete issues and focus on the big problems and big issues instead of kind of delivering the same amount of recommendation to each country? Would it be more credible? Would it create a more credible process and from that perspective make the member states commit better to the process if we are concentrating only on the big issues and big problems? And that is one thing which is to my mind actually quite important for this whole process. General recommendation, not detailed, but focused on the big issues. That is perhaps my question to Bart, not so much as a comment.
Thank you very much, Pasi. And then Dorte, would you like to react on?
Okay. Very interesting interventions here again. So I'll start with the implication of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is held a lot of promise, but I think it was also hindered by becoming binding just as the crisis hit. So somehow it has not, when you struggling with also economic aims, really gained the sufficient playing level as some of was originally envisioned with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So oftentimes it of course becomes a question of whether we should go for the social content of the Charter if we also have austerity measures. And then we have seen concrete examples of the Charter then becoming somehow subordinated to the more primary aims of economics. So there's still a question of how these more fundamental parts of the treaties should be balanced towards one another. And that eventually cannot be solved alone by the Court of Justice, but needs also some more political direction. So the Charter has not shown sufficient enforceability as of now. It may come, but it's still sort of weak in demonstrating results. Lost in translation, I very much agree on that. These pieces of legislation, but also of soft law, has very different meanings across the board. And for sure it will be very difficult to create a common playing field if we do not somehow overcome these misinterpretations between the member states. But that should be doable somehow. It's a matter of translation and taking that on, of course. What is more concerning for me is, of course, when we look into the heterogeneity of the member states and the social protection that varies so fundamentally between Eastern and Western member countries, but also between Southern member states and then the richer Northern member states. But even if we look within clusters, so even if we take to continental Europe and we look at how much Germany and Austria can even disagree on matters, there's a lot of heterogeneities that has to be addressed, not only in terms of social protection, but of course also in political understanding of what should make it top of the agenda here. So for me, there is a significant call for politics when we address matters of social Europe. And also to understand that this is highly important for European integration as such. We should not forget that these matters actually were core themes of Brexit and the UK referendum. So there needs to be a social agenda for the European Union, but it also has to consist of binding rules that are enforceable at the national level, because I will start with my opening remark. I don't think that soft law governance can do it alone. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. We let Bart react, and then there will be possibility for Kirsi-Marja and Pasi Moisio to react as well.
Thank you, Chairman. Wow, so many useful and challenging comments. So first of all, Pasi, you explained that had a difference between the country-specific recommendation that will finally or is finally being adopted and the one that the Commission proposed. For me, so I'm very glad you stressed that, and this is very good news. It's what I tried to hint at during my intervention. It means that in spite of the very high burden, in spite of the fact that Member States have to organize a qualified majority vote against the Commission, they can still achieve very important changes, and it happens. So I think this is, in view of the, let's say, the legitimacy of the whole European semester, I think this is a big improvement with regard to the first years of the semester, and this is also what I meant, that European committees together, Economic Policy Committee, Employment Committee and SPC, are now play the game in a better way, to some extent with and to some extent against, but mostly together with the European Commission. Now, on the socialization of the European semester, Pasi, I think this is what you wanted to say, but you couldn't say anymore because you already suppressed the idea. Maybe what you wanted to say is that I'm too optimistic about the role of the social committees in the European semester. I don't know if that's what you wanted to say. It is. You see, I sense the energy. No, just to be very clear, I don't claim in any way that the Economic Policy Committee, let alone the EFC, the Employment Committee and the Social Protection Committee are on the same footing in the semester. It's not at all the case. I agree with you there. There is still a very clear hierarchy, EFC, EPC, EMCO, SPC. It's there. What the big change is that DG Employment of the European Commission gained a place that is almost, in my view, on an equal footing with DG ECFIN, the Secretariat General and DG GROW, which is a very important change. I say almost at the same footing. And next to that, the SPC, but especially the Employment Committee, became more important players in the process, but absolutely not at the same level of the financial committees, which is still a road that needs to be taken. So I hope that that nuances my account sufficiently. Now, this said, I'm very much in agreement with Eva, if that's what you wanted to say, Eva, that in the end we have really gained a lot through the semester when compared to previous processes. I would really not want to go back to, let's say, the Lisbon strategy, where social affairs ministers, ministers for health, ministers for labor, etc., could say whatever they wanted on their affairs. They were not contradicted by anyone else because no one was listening to them. There was no negotiation because the social affairs were completely sidelined in the Lisbon strategy. Now at least, okay, now it's true that social affairs and employment players, they're still slightly subdued or largely subdued to economic actors, but at least they are talking to each other, and indeed, as you said, they have to agree at home before they go and take a position in Brussels. And this is essential. So I really, even if there is a price that has been paid, I think the price is correct. And the fact that Jenny is with us today, someone from the finance minister, I don't know if you would have been here, for example, during the Lisbon strategy. You will tell us after the break. Now, Jenny, your question about harmonization of social protection systems. When I talk about a directive on minimum income, to be very clear, I don't talk about a harmonization of minimum income schemes. No way. A, because we will never have it politically, and B, because I don't know at what level we would have to harmonize it. It's just unthinkable. By contrast, obliging member states, every member state, to have a nationally defined minimum income, I think is a very good idea, but it's not a harmonization. It's obliging member states to have such a scheme. It's slightly different with regard to the proposals that are out there from SEPS and other think tanks about a European unemployment benefit scheme, where you would indeed need a minimum harmonization on the criteria to give such an EU unemployment benefit, because if this acts as an automatic stabilizer, then there need to be confidence between member states, and there this would be, I think, the big or the one example, or the only example maybe, where I think some harmonization may be required. Then with regard to fundamental rights, I think Maya's question has been answered by Dorte. Eva, lost in translation, yes, absolutely. I think I already referred to the fact that some Eastern European member states, for example, were very surprised when they heard the term social exclusion for the first time. They had never heard of that. They thought about poverty and other terms, but not social exclusion. And so, yes, we are often lost in translation. And we are also in the European Pillar of Social Rights. So these are principles that actually read as rights, and they're formulated as rights, but they are principles, and the overall heading are rights, but then Alan Larsen, who negotiates this on behalf of the Commission, or who wrote it on behalf of the Commission, said it is going to be politically binding, but not legally binding per se, but it will be supported by legal initiatives. If you're a citizen, what does this mean? So I completely agree, let's at least be fair and very clear about what it's going to be. And the term European Pillar of Social Rights, in my view, is very badly chosen, because it's not going to be a pillar of rights. So I very strongly support the initiative, but let's be clear on what it's going to be and what it's not going to be. At the same time, as I said, I very strongly hope that there will be an agreement on this pillar of social, I don't know what, you will think of a term, Eva. It will give the Commission a social agenda, legitimacy to come up with legislation, if it's accompanied by a clear roadmap for implementation, and only then. So I hope you will use your pre-presidency forces to push the heads of state and government in that directive. Finally, on the poverty target, yes, you're right, it's the poverty and social inclusion target. I'm sorry for cutting it short. It's important to underline this. The important for me is that I think there's a scope to beef up the EU ambition in this respect, knowing that indeed the UN Sustainable Development Goals are much more ambitious and that we are not at all delivering. So if some presidency could pick up this UN Sustainable Development Goals and make it clear or discuss with the member states how each of them are going to go towards that goal by 2030, I think this would be a very nice way of complementing the European semester with either a parallel or an integrated process that is more focused on at least this part of the social agenda. So much more to be said, but I'll stop there, Chair.
Microphone. Sorry. There were so many points I would like to comment, but I start somewhere and I go back to the Nordic countries, and I really understand why, Dorte, your skepticism about the soft governance, because why it works in the Nordic countries, it's because we are described as very strong countries of a rule of law. So, and social issues come very, very near the social rights, and also that we have this common understanding of the vocabulary. When we speak about welfare, we think about citizens traveling through life with good options. It actually fair meaning traveling, and well meaning the good traveling. So we already speak about something else than only social problems or poverty. And And also that our way of thinking, it's very closely linked to our perception of democracy. So when you put things, when issues end up on the political agenda, it's not only that the issue is labeled by a random politician or political party, it's labeled by, or it's previously been debated by the citizens that are concerned. This is how sort of the social issues especially end up in the agenda. What groups are heard and sort of have had a possibility to say what they think about, and then formulate the question, whether it's a question of welfare or poverty, or sort of, I don't know if I can express myself clearly enough, but very seldom in Nordic countries we sort of have targeted programs. If we end up changing legislation, we speak about very often about collective solutions to a social problem. So if we want to make something better, for example, for children, so it's this universal, we use these universal tools. We don't have targeted programs for mothers on welfare, single mothers on welfare. Our thinking is so totally different, and then that we and I have to say that because I have my colleague here, the quality of social services, it's a tricky one, because when you enter a term like quality, then you already are culturally biased. You don't know what we are thinking about when you say quality. About name these baskets of was it services and goods. But still, well, in the European context, I think that the only way is to sort of use a soft and combine also these few sanctions that are, and because, I mean, what else can you do? I think the Nordic way of having these endless discussions, as we have also having, I mean, this congregation here today is a typical example of a Nordic meeting. We discuss, and I think it's a useful tool also in the European context. But engaging, and Ismo was pointing out how many are part of this discussion, engaging larger circles in order to formulate also the issues that end up on the political agenda.
Thank you very much, Kirsi-Marja. She's just inviting us to discuss until we are all so tired that it's closed and no more disagreements. That's a good approach. Now, Pasi, please, you wanted to react.
Okay, thank you. Apparently there was some loss in translation too in my presentation or comment. Actually, I really meant that all the proposals or social goals or targets or minimum income proposals you make, you should have solid calculations on the costs and benefits and income distribution impacts on that. And I'm talking about Euromod tax benefit market simulation model. Coding either minimum income scheme with a threshold of 60% of the median, the EU poverty risk threshold. Nobody really have done it. I would really like to see that framework program or some other research finance instrument would finance a large scale research project to estimate what would it mean if we set minimum income, national minimum income, 60% of the national median income. I mean, the costs on public expenditure, the income distributions, the work incentives, etc., etc. That would probably opened many people's eyes, because it's very easy to say something noble goals and ideas, and once somebody actually do the math and calculation, see that they somehow turn out to be rather different. And I'm referring to the basic income experiment that we have in Finland. I mean, it's a massive political debate. I mean, like we said here, I think 80% of the people are somehow against basic income, and the rest of them are fighting and arguing what basic income really is. But what the basic income experiment and the research project around it, it has brought a lot of knowledge, both to researchers and public, but also to policymakers. What would it mean to have basic income scheme in Finland? And I would rather see similar kind of enhancement or improvement of using research knowledge also in EU level policy goal setting and also the policy evaluations in that sense. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pasi. I very much like your idea of this thorough impact assessment or cost-benefit analysis. And I remember from the time when I was developing European legislation, the best legislation was developed when the discussion on the impact assessment or cost-benefit analysis took more time than the discussion on the regulation itself. And that's, of course, a very, very good starting point for any proper action. Now, let's listen to the other colleagues. You certainly have heard a big number of interesting themes, and any reactions, comments, questions before we go back to the panelists here? Yes, Vertti, please.
Yes, Vertti Kiukas, Secretary General of the Finnish Umbrella Organizations for Social Affairs and Health. I've been listening to this conversation with a very, very positive ear. So to say, we have a very strong tendency in Finland to think and discuss, at least from the official side, and I must confess that I was thinking, does your ministers know, Pasi, what you are speaking here? But that the EU should be as far as possible from all what begins social in political spheres. That has been a very long tradition for over 20 years of our membership, and I think, and the NGO field in Finland think that this is quite an out-of-date approach. We have commenting also the Danish opinions that we see there is an imbalance between the economic and social aspects of the semester. Of course, we need a very sound public economy in order to maintain the welfare state, but now it seems that the social aspects of all politics is, how to say, lower in ranking than the economic policy. So the economic policy is number one, and every other field of politics comes on a much later stage. And this has led to that conclusion that, for example, what Pasi began with, that there is a strong investment nature in this welfare economy thinking, that we have a high grade of social security, we have a good education system. It builds the coming growth of nations, and that's why we need a better balance. So if there are very hard policy measures behind the economic sphere of the semester, like the debt criteria or the deficit criteria, and the social side is more that it would be nice if you think about these also attitude. There is an imbalance, and I think that there should be a better balance, and this leads to the idea that the Commission should have, or the EU should have, some kind of competencies also in these social questions. And I do think that the social, in Nordic perspective, at least in Finnish too is a broader thing than the labour market thing, and that's why it has been very good that during the, I'd say, past 2-3 years we have had a very good dialogue between the representation of the EU Commission here in Finland and the NGO field also. We have to remind that there are lots of people who are not able to work in our communities. And then what comes to the measures, we have to divide everything that means that the money is transferred over borders. I think there is no political will anywhere to increase measures that takes money, if you say it bluntly, more from north to south. So that is not going to happen, but we should have much more emphasis on balances inside member countries. So also when the Commission gives recommendations, it should state that there needs to be a better balance inside member countries, that the member countries should more actively propose social policy. And I think that's the one key thing we have to bear in mind. And the last point is that we have lots of strategies in social policy. We have this 2020, for example, it said that Finnish should decrease its grade of poverty. Then we have these social development goals 2030. We have Council of Europe recommendations. These all go to the same ends, but they are not very well coordinated in any member countries.
Yes, please.
I'm scared a little bit about our working life in these situations, and I think that the future work is changing dramatically. And of course we have to take care of employment and working conditions in that sense, because working life is longer than earlier. It means the career changes, and we have to take care of young people. We have to take care of those who are living in rush hours, and then senior ones. And in that sense, this social protection is very, very important if you think about new forms of employment. And if people are traveling between different employment styles, it means a little bit different world as it is now. And then I'm a little bit scared skills and competence as well, because we have to have competent workers if we think about the competitiveness of our different member states in this the whole Europe. And I think so that well-being economics is very important, because we have calculated in Finland cost of lost labor input. And I think that it's one part of our social protection world. And if we wanted to have those youngsters at work and defer the exclusion at work, it's important to take care of all these aspects which are belonging to the budgeting and costs and economics versus social life at work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw somebody's hand raised. No? Was I just wishing for to see? Yes, I knew that it was somewhere. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sarita Freeman-Korpela. I am working for the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, and I'm currently working with social and health reform. Thank you for all of you for very rich discussions today. And my first question is about how the European Commission reviews these reforms in terms of social impacts. I mean, what is Commission point of view when assessing the reforms in in this respect? And also other way around, that how the member states who are currently working or who have worked or is maybe in the process of different kind of reforms take account the reforms role in European semester. I think that is something that could and should be better discussed and scanned, and I think that would benefit all stakeholders. And I would like to thank all of you who have already mentioned sustainable development goals. I think those have been unused tool so far, and something I think that which could be something in common to all the member states and the Commission as well, and I think we should be much more efficient there. And the second point about the reforms, I think that we need to take account the new world, as you said. We may move boxes of service structures here and there, but if we do not take the preventive factors seriously in social health and employment field, for example, if we don't tackle the social exclusion and discrimination, we don't get where we want. So it is not the social structures alone that we should work with, but also these preventing and other aspects which are not so, which are soft. Let's put it that way. And finally, I would like to conclude by referring our former president and Nobel Prize winner Martti Ahtisaari, who said last weekend, I think it was, that behind every political shift or crisis there is one common denominator, and that is sentiment of inequality. So that is something that you cannot buy with economics or with the finance politics. You have to have the sense of trust and sense of equality at the national level and the EU level as well. And even though, as you mentioned, that it is already 10 years when the economic crisis started, but we are still in the midst of political consequences and the social consequences. So that alone is an argument for or discussing or taking the social aspect seriously. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Good questions and comments. Anything else? Pasi, yes.
Quick comments about the assessment of policy impacts. I was happy to notice that Eurostat has started to publish flash estimate on income distribution and poverty and exclusion. In the first time they tried to separate the policy impact from the structural changes, at least in the EU level. And I was very, just to let you know, I mean, because you know, just following the social indicators is, you know, without separating the policy impact is, you know, well, you probably know what I mean, but still.
Thank you very much. Any other urgent needs to react before we go back to our speakers? Maybe I just quickly react to Sarita's point on assessing reforms. Colleagues here will complement that, but that's, if not the most difficult, but one of the most challenging tasks to do, because you just take something that is called sote reform in Finland. Those who know it, if I asked you now to assess its implementation rate, is it 20% or 80% or 90% or 50%? It would very much depend on what your criteria would be, how you judge what is already implemented, what is not. Very often in the Commission, the simple approach was to say that if, or some in the Commission, because it's an issue that is within the House as well discussed, some parties consider that when the government has done its job, when it has made a legislative proposal to the national parliament, and quickly thinking that's a fantastic idea because it's simple and easy. But then when you go back to the SOTE reform, how many proposals has this government made, and the government previously, and even governments before that, and they never went through the parliament? Then you can ask, what is the right measurement for a successfully implemented reform? And I think we have still not yet found a good solution for that. It's very, very tricky. What has helped us a lot to understand or to judge the level of implementation of a given reform is that when the number of stakeholders in the semester process has increased, like labour social partners, NGOs, experts, etc., etc., we have realized that we get a very, very different picture of, for example, of SOTE reform if we speak to people in the ministry responsible for it, to a ministry that is not directly responsible but impacted of it, if we go to those who represent doctors and those to etc., etc. And when putting together that picture gives you quite an interesting and more mature view of the situation, but it's still very difficult to express it in writing what the implementation rate and level there is. But that just very quickly, but I think Bart was ready to react now. Yes. Did I? Yeah. The other way around.
Okay, thank you. Yes, a couple of points. I wish I didn't have a plane to catch because we could go on until 10 actually. Yeah, so first of all, Kirsi-Marja, you came back to the Nordic countries' perspective and mentioning the rule of law, etc., which brought me back to a point that was raised earlier. I think you said, yeah, you clearly said that Finland benefited most from this Nordic cooperation, but then added, or you said that, and then you added an important nuance, that in the end, the fact that Finland benefited so much from that, especially, or also benefited the other Nordic countries. Now, I think, for me, this is an absolutely key insight in view of a presidency. Just to relate it to something Dorte said, you said you explained that EU citizens provided the net contribution to the Danish welfare system. And you said, you introduced that by saying, I will end on a positive note. And I admit that being not Danish or not Nordic, I was surprised that you called that a positive conclusion. Because what if the Danish welfare system would have contributed net to these EU citizens? For me, that would have been a sign of solidarity. So it really depends on the point of view that you take to see whether this is positive or not. I totally understand in which context you say it, of course. But, you know, with a view to a presidency, I think, yeah, the idea of pushing EU solidarity, for example, in the context of EU unemployment benefit scheme or a directive on minimum income, should really go beyond the purely national perspective. And this is something that I still miss a bit in the discussion. Secondly, with regard to minimum income, again, the European Economic and Social Committee published a study 2 years ago, I think, where there is some kind of an assessment, including scenarios, budgets that have been calculated to indeed try to pin the cost of the introduction of an EU directive on a minimum income scheme. So maybe have a look at it. If you don't, I'd be happy to send you the report or the reference. It was written by one of my researchers at the European Social Observatory. This basic income experiment, just to mention, within the context of the European Social Policy Network, ESPN, that we are managing on behalf of the European Commission, there were 1 or 2 short flash reports written on this basic income experiment. And just to mention that in the download data of those flashes, this is the flash report, it's 3 pages. It has been disseminated and downloaded massively across the EU, and so just to tell you, this is reaching a lot of attention. So, I don't know, during your presidency, do you want to feature this? Do you want to organize a peer review? Do you want to organize some, because it's really attracting a lot of attention. So I think there would be really an EU learning dimension in that respect. But it's just a thought. Then, Verti, yeah, you said that it's a bit of an out-of-date attitude to that some ministers, I don't know which ministers you meant, want the EU as far as possible from domestic social policies. I guess that's what you said. I couldn't agree more. And I'll just give you the illustration, and I of course talk under the discretion here of Dorte's opinion. Healthcare. Healthcare, I already mentioned it, is explicitly not an EU competence. It's in the treaty, right? At the same time, there are, of course, country-specific recommendations on healthcare reform. There is the Stability and Growth Pact and the macroeconomic imbalances procedure where healthcare, of course, features importantly. There is an OMC on healthcare, which, by the way, is not very effective. So there I agree, soft governance doesn't really work. State aid legislation, the role of the Court of Justice of the EU, internal market legislation, all of that has a very important impact on your national healthcare system. Only health ministers don't decide. They leave, because they don't want to discuss it at the EU level, they leave the discretion and the decision to other ministers. So what I would very strongly argue here is that giving a bit more leeway to healthcare ministers, or if they appropriate some agenda at the EU level and they want to have a bit of a more collective say, they will in the end gain influence at the national level. That's my point of view. I'm happy to hear also from Verti that the dialogue with the European Commission and some stakeholders in Finland is working pretty well. I was just curious to hear from you, Chairman, whether the ideas that we put forward to the Commission to streamline how European semester officers engage with stakeholders like Verti at the national level, whether this is a good idea. Is there internal learning going on among these European semester officers on how they should do this? Because I know from interviews that in some countries it works very well. They involve a lot of stakeholders. They organize many meetings like the one that you just invited all of us to. In other countries it really doesn't work very well. So how can this be improved at the level of the Commission? That would be maybe even a point for the presidency. And then finally, Hannu, your point about, you're concerned about future of work and skills. I completely agree with you. Just to add on that, there's a lot of concern for the moment, also in the heads of some people in the European Commission, about platform economy, digital economy, and what all of this means in terms of social protection, because we basically don't know. And so I think there will be some initiatives, including in terms of studies, that try to understand how relevant is this new economy, this digital economy, with regard to social protection. Sarita, I just finished my PhD on the hard politics of soft governance. If you want, I'll send it to you. But more seriously, on assessing reforms, I just mentioned, and then I will really shut up, Chairman. A prudent estimate of the European Commission is that about, if I'm not wrong, that about 50% of all CSRs are being implemented by the member states. The methodology for that is not very clear. It's not public, but the estimate that I heard is it's about 50%. And I'm being told that this is a very prudent estimate. Now, Business Europe, whom most of you know, or this organization most of you know, says based on this figure, the European semester is a total failure, because there is only 50% of implementation. I'm really baffled by that. If it's true that there's 50% of implementation through a soft governance instrument, it's not legally constraining, it's about social protection, labor market, and many other very sensitive areas, then I find 50% of implementation almost scary in terms of influence, and another reason for the future Finnish presidency and the Social Affairs Ministry to get its hands on it.
Thank you very much. I will react on your few points before we give the floor to Veli-Mikko. But before that, we have 2 minutes, which Dorte and Pasi will share now. Dorte will start, please.
Wonderful, Bart. You took everything all the time. No, it doesn't matter. I'll just start on insisting on my positive note, because I think it was a positive, very positive finding, because the main conclusion here is that in contrast to the whole idea about welfare tourism, these findings prove that the rules of the European Union in relation to free movement and cross-border welfare has not created open gateways to the welfare state. Those that come in actually contribute more than they cost the welfare state, and that can be used then for other redistributive purposes of the welfare state. So it is positive. The other thing I want to comment on is your concern about new forms of employment arising, atypical work, and especially hitting hard on the young part of the employment force, and I totally share that. I think that it's really important here that we also get the kind of institutional logic clear, because what is that caused by? Is it Europeanization or globalization, or is it also in great part caused by domestic politics? So if we look to one of the main examples of those new forms of employment being created, for example Germany, with mini-jobs and midi-jobs, that was of course a result of the Hartz IV reform. So pure domestic politics, which now also kick into this atypical forms of employment that we see very much unfolding and increasing in its importance. So I think that it's really important to bring in domestic politics and insist on the responsibilities of domestic politics in these matters. And then also to get the competences right. So what is the competence of the European Union? What can the European Union do? And what should be left for domestic politics really to address? And to have that message clearly formulated to the populations, because otherwise I understand that people get a bit confused sometimes. Let me just finish here. This is also on another note which is political, and this is where decisions are taken. So sort of my reluctance to these soft law mechanisms are also that they are taken in committees which do not involve politicians necessarily. National parliaments do not have direct access to these decision-making forums, and neither do stakeholders. So that is also of concern. So I think if we really want to make these decision-making forums sustainable and resilient also in the future, they have to bring in the actors that are actually elected. And the stakeholders, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dorte. And Pasi, please.
Very, very rapidly. To Verti's very good intervention, I just mentioned that, yes, indeed, Finland has a strong official position that the social issues should have a bigger role in semester. That is agreed, and that is our position. One aspect also I wanted to raise is the impact assessment. I'm glad, very glad that it has been risen so many times, and it has a strong role in this discussion. And it should have a stronger role in semester, and social issues should be assessed more during the semester process. How? That is one thing we should work further, and there we come to the role of the, for example, Social Protection Committee, what could be the role of SPC, and of course, at the end of the day, EPSCO ministers. Yet one issue, I just wanted quickly to say, comment what Bart raised. You mentioned that health doesn't have EU competence, and beside of that we have CSRs. Yes, indeed. That is one good example that we really have country-specific recommendation on the area where the EU don't have a real competence. And you mentioned that health ministers are not involved. That is also very, very true. And that's the reason that all the CSRs we have recently received regarding the health sector are from the macroeconomic perspective. They are cost effectiveness, which is the angle there. So that is one example that train goes. So if we want to be on the train and participate to discussion. That would be very, very important. Then finally, Mr. Chair, just to mention briefly that Hannu raised a very important issue, well-being economics, and for example, occupational health and safety has an extremely important role in supporting growth, and all the investments they are worthwhile making, and they have a really good data provided to back up this claim. And Sarita raised also the prevention, the role of the prevention, and it's not only important for the economy but also societal stability. Just perhaps I stop here.
Thank you very much, Pasi. Now, I was thinking of concluding. No, I wasn't. I just wanted to reply maybe to But's question about whether streamlining the way ESOs engage with stakeholders would make sense. Maybe I can take a step backwards to tell where we are and where we are going in that sense. When the 2011 so-called six-pack regulation package was there, and it was decided between the member states and the Commission, and then of other institutions as well, that let's put the ECFIN Commission official into the representations in the member states. It was a radical approach, change in approach when it comes to these representations, because for the first time there was a substance, official working on substance, so developing EU either legislation or, in this case, the country-specific, the country analysis, the economic analysis, and in participating in the development of the country-specific recommendations to the country. Previously, all this work had been done in the member states, and the representations were more like information officers and reporting officers and that kind of. So that was a radical change. In end of 2011, I think the first ESOs were put in some of the first countries, and then 2012 there was a host of them. But very quickly during the first year it was seen that this actually works, that it makes sense that we are here next to each other and we can talk in the national language, and we hopefully we can hope that the Commission officials also have some understanding of the member states' realities, which is very difficult when you are in Brussels. If you just think that you've been 20, 30 years abroad, away from your member state or any member state where you're working, you don't see things as you see if you can talk directly to people who are in flesh next to you. Now to Finland, of course I've been personally very pleased and also I would say happy, because Finland is a country where people tend to talk to each other, and if they don't know something, they will ask you, and they will not let you go easily if you don't answer to their questions. So one question is that you refer to, that there is different way of engaging. Partly it's because the ESOs came to the member states in different times. Some already 2011, most 12, some 13, and I came only beginning of 2014, and so forth. So of course there was a big difference in terms of starting the process. Secondly, the people that came had very different priorities and very different knowledges. Most of them are senior people that have been cooked well in different EU negotiation procedures, so they had some tools to come and interact with the national people. But the professionals in the member states are also working in different way than people in Brussels. So it was a little bit of a learning process at the beginning, both sides. The second aspect is that when the second, and in the bigger member states, the third European Commission official came, of course it became much, much easier, because just imagine yourself that you're following the whole range of policies relevant to economic policy. It's about energy, labour market, it's social policy, it's everything, absolutely everything. Maybe culture can be put aside, but it's really everything. So alone, just one person always normally a Commission expert from a sectoral specific sector. It's very difficult, even if we have often worked in several sectors like I have done. So that's one aspect, the kind of process which led us to the member states and the type of people that came here. Now the second question was that the member states have very different traditions and very different ways of working and very different structures. And for example, social partners, I mean, I think today in every member state they will know what a European Commission official is doing there within the semester. But just 1 year ago there were member states where most stakeholders didn't know that such an official existed in the member state. So there was a lot of kind of learning, mutual learning process. Now, internally, we are now about 52 Commission officials in the member states. We meet regularly, and we have now underway an evaluation of the ESOs, as we call, and even an external evaluator is being engaged, and some good auditing has taken place, and they have even come to Finland and interviewed colleagues from different ministries, from social partners, etc., in order to consider what we should do with this institution. Does it work? Does it provide adequate services? Is it useful for the Commission? Is it useful for stakeholders, member states, social partners, NGOs, etc.? So there is a process going on in that development. And if we want to streamline it, then we will have a little bit similar problems like we were today talking about minimum income, harmonized minimum incomes. Member states are so different, and their cultures and way of working are very, very different. So I think the measurement of the usefulness of that institution and its output must happen maybe in a more varied way. But it's a very welcome approach, saying that, of course, we should always, in whatever job we do, there should be some kind of checking of how that is conducted. And of course, now I invite you back to on the 27th of November. Welcome and check how the ESO is doing his work. So that's for Finland. Now, very good. But we have come to the end of the discussions. It's been extremely useful. But we still have one major speaker here to contribute to the event. Veli Mikko Niemi, Director General from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. The floor is yours, please.